Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the torchlight of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka feverishly gooning to the Euronymous half-shirt picture.
I'm sure you wouldn't be the first. And I am the black metal guy, aka banned by Slanesh admin.
Probably for gooning to the Euronymous half-shirt picture.
Exactly.
Yeah. What god damn, that's like an 80s holdover thing, I guess. It is crazy watching some sort of lower budget 80s movies and seeing guys walk around in clothing like that.
Yeah, it's funny. Quorthon. I mean, I think on the cover of the Third Bathory record, he's wearing that, right?
Oh yeah, does he have a half-shirt picture?
I think so. Or, well, I guess it's a Goat Man is on the cover, but I think on the promo art for, let's see, for Under the Sign, there's someone who knows, Fred, who knows Bathory better than either of us will tell us, but there's a famous photo of him, where he's definitely wearing that.
It is intriguing that there was a period of time where a display of hypermasculinity was to bare your midriff.
It is weird. I mean, why not just not wear a shirt? I guess they have to let you into the bar, right? But okay, why not wear just like a leather vest with nothing under it? That's respectable.
That's doable. You can be in a black metal band like on stage and do that. But I would have to agree that no shirt is far, far better philosophically than half shirt.
Yeah, well, it's it's funny. The internet has really latched onto that Euronymous photo, and now in the sort of parallel universe black metal, there's this whole mythos of queer Euronymous or whatever. You can find plenty of other photos of Euronymous just looking like a cool guy who plays guitar.
Yeah.
Someone posted one on Instagram a while ago, and I was like, "Shit, that's Euronymous." I would have thought that was the bassist. What's his name? But
Necro Butcher, yeah.
Yeah, Necro Butcher, yeah.
Well, I think Necro Butcher, yeah. I think the queer Euronymous thing has to be just like the product of the same middle-aged women that think that any two male friends in a TV show are gay. Like they were writing supernatural gay fan fiction before they found black metal.
Yeah, well, it's yes. Oh, that goes back to the Twilight question.
I almost did the Twilight of extreme metal podcasts.
Oh, well, next time.
Next time, yes. That'll maybe is that the idea? Maybe we do a Terminus live stream where we do a viewing and commentary of all the Twilight movies.
Oh my God. We have to do the Marduk discography first.
Oh God, I don't know what I dread more. I mean, Marduk would be better to listen to, but possibly somehow more exhausting than all.
Oh, it would definitely it would definitely be exhausting. It would be. I mean, the Twilight movies are hilarious. 25 Marduk albums would be. That would be insane. Plus, both of us are less sort of inebriated than we used to be. Yeah. So I think it would be difficult.
Oh God, I don't know. If we were as inebriated as we used to be, we couldn't get through it. I think we could. I would invent some sort of drinking game for Marduk where it's like you have to take a drink every time there's a blast beat and every time the word Satan is shrieked, and just collapse 3 albums deep.
Yeah. Drink every time there's a blast beat. There were some great. I knew some great dudes in England who introduced me to a thing called the Sharps Rifles drinking game. Do you know Sharps Rifles?
No, I'm not familiar.
Very cool novel series by Bernard Cornwell, who did the also The Last Kingdom, which they made a pretty good show of. But the sort of hard-bitten historical fiction. And there was some BBC adaptation of it, and you just watch Sharps Rifles, and every time somebody fires a rifle, you drink.
And how effective is it?
Let's say I don't remember the end.
This is a little one Gash, and you're listening to Terminus.
All right, and we are back with a review that makes us feel old because of how long we've been doing this goddamn show. It is Ukraine's They Came From Visions with their long-awaited sophomore record, The Twilight Robes, out on Eisenwald. And we first came into contact with this band because we reviewed their late 2020 full-length Cloak of Darkness, Dagger of Night. At that time, what they were doing was some sort of mixture of Ukrainian black metal, generally in the style of Drudkin, that circle, plus a lot more kind of American or Central European sounding post-black type stuff. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I'd say so. I think that as we discover on this record as well, that these guys have a unique take on the relationship between those styles, and they sort of suggest that post-black maybe inherently just has a lot to do with Slavblack. But yes, your assessment's basically
yeah. They're all about like taking the returning the post-black to its origins in Slavic black metal. And this record really is much more of a down-the-line black metal record, but of the sort of a stranger variety. The tonal colors you can all hear on various, I don't know, like say on one of the weirder Druid records like the Swan Road. You can get some of the strange harmonic shifts, tense major key, unexpected dissonance. There's all sorts of weird skronky moments in Astrophase that happen almost by accident. But it's very much like the Kharkov scene being wired through the American bands who they influenced, especially stuff like Yellow Eyes and Krallis. I think was mentioned in the press release.
Yeah, this is. I mean, this record in particular is interesting because now, so I liked the first record a lot. I was more of a fan of it than you were. It was definitely sort of uneven in parts. I listened to it again in anticipation of this review, and my assessment was pretty much the same. Like, overall, I really like it, but there's definitely, like, intense unevenness. Here, it seems like the band has really landed on a very particular sound of their own that does, have a lot to do with Slavic black metal and some of these skronkier American bands, but also just sort of a direct referential, like, folk metal quality and a little bit more Ukrainian stuff along the lines of Nocturnal Mortem. Just minus the ostentatious symphonic qualities.
I think I can actually hear that. There's some unexpected thrashing stuff that happens on here. And I could hear that being a Nocturnal Mortem or generally sort of like folk metal thing. Okay, the band they mentioned in the promo wasn't Krallis, it was Vigadude.
Oh, okay.
Right? Yeah. And we both love those first 2 or 3 Vigadude records.
Yeah.
Just huge fans. And they sound, they're Belgian, but it sounds, that scene is, they're like basically screamo or post-hardcore dudes. So their sound is very touched by that as well. And you can hear some of that, but at this point, everything that recognizably has to do with post-black or screamo or whatever in They Came From Visions sound, it's all the weirdest and most difficult and eeriest aspects of that. There's really not many more. There's not like the nice twinkly riffs. There's powerful there's sort of like overflowing noble folk melody here, but that's in a much more direct black metal mode, right? And that's mixed in with stuff that's a lot more unsettling.
Yeah, there's stuff on this that reminds me, in terms of the juxtaposition of folk and black metal, some of the most intense moments of this really remind me of Forefather, with the sort of like almost overly gallant and celebratory melodies, but delivered way too fast and way too intensely, and clearly not in an uplifting or positive way. And
with a kind of like
and the mechanical blasting too.
Yes, a kind of mechanical austere repetition, right? Mm-hmm. That's an interesting comparison. Yeah, this album does. I think it could stand to sound even more unhinged, but it sounds pretty unhinged, and I can hear that connection to the Forefather for sure.
I could see it being more unhinged, but at the same time, I think one of the strengths of this album is how varied it is. Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of stuff going on, across just 45 minutes. This demonstrates a lot of range, and really just like. This album sounds like it took a lot more time to write than the first, and it was very considered, and a lot of time was probably spent in the recording and production phases.
Yeah, that makes sense, because it is 45 minutes, but it feels faster than 45 minutes, but when you try to think of the range of stuff on it, you think it's much longer.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and let's also not forget the huge chunk of sort of like swaggering heavy metal stuff that pops up on a semi-regular basis. It's interesting because there's a lot of moments across this record where they seem to be gesturing toward a big post-black payoff, but instead they divert into like a huge heavy metal riff. And I think that's a really fascinating head fake technique. Like that happens really distinctly at the end of the record.
Well, yeah, the end of the record is awesome.
Oh, yeah, it's so cool.
I feel like there's heavy metal there. It sounds sort of like the almost the metal punk thing, or just stomping oi black metal. There's some very odd stuff that happens towards the end. Generally, there's more kind of there's a lot more sort of direct. There's a lot more direct, vigorous riffing in a heavy metal or pagan black metal spirit than you got on the last one.
Yeah, which is interesting because there are excellent riffs on this record, but it doesn't really feel like a riffs album to me.
I hear that.
Yeah, I think this is an album that's a lot more interested in sort of playing with structure in interesting ways. Setting riffs against each other in unusual arrangements. They're taking most of the constituent parts of this record are pretty conventional in terms of like melodic quality or black metal riff craft, but they seem to want to make sort of deliberately difficult and unusual stuff out of material that was available relatively early on in the genre.
Yeah. So with that, we want to get to the first sample?
Yeah, well, I guess we should just play it, because like a lot of shit happens on this, and as we get into it, there will be a lot to talk about. I think that'll unfold with the samples.
Cool, yeah, so this is my first sample. This is the second track, although I guess it's the first real track, Equinox Ablaze, and you'll hear some heroic druid riffing, and then some other stuff.
The
So it sort of, they come in pretty hot and then instantly pare it way back tempo-wise, very early on. And they do it in a rhythmically cool way that shows pretty deep kind of pagan black and heavy metal knowledge. Mm-hmm. Like that sort of like slowed down, lower mid-tempo, like triplet lope. That's almost like a Doom kind of thing.
Or it's like a sort of polished up Graveland thing.
Yeah, I think Graveland, it's like Graveland for sure. I don't think he uses it actually, but it's like something he could do. I think it comes from Bathory, and then you end up with things like that in Graveland. But it's the kind of movie, it makes me think of like a lot of English stuff like Ildra, who do mostly at that tempo, or like Forefather could totally do that.
Yeah. It's also kind of, and just the execution of that to me is really reminiscent of like, I keep going back to this but like Wintersorg stuff, those edges of sort of prog folk, like blackened prog folk stuff that the Borknagar guys would do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. So in the middle, it's kind of got, it gets its heaviness purely from that extremely syncopated triplet strut, and then you've got pretty guitars over it and the clean vocals. Those remind you, I assume, of Wintersorg?
A little bit. Wintersorg is a little bit more dramatic in his vocal performance, but the whole execution, the whole vibe of that, especially the way it arrives in this song in this sort of unexpected moment and is committed to a lot more than other bands would do, really reminds me of him.
Yeah, word. And then the riff at the end is sick, and that, that really does kind of sound like something Forefather or any of those English bands would play. Or like a Solstice riff.
That's a really good one. I also think that the opening riff, that trem riff, is interesting because like that's sort of not too far from like a Slavic version of something that would have been on that last Narbeleth record we covered. This keening sort of like going further up the fretboard than you anticipate and not descending down in a clean way, sort of spiraling down, using these more difficult intervals to. I like how it leads up with this sort of like big dramatic Take-esque run down the fretboard, but then it moves into this grayer, more fraught territory. I like the mood there.
Yeah, you're right. That's a very good. That's a very good riff that doesn't do. It's just a riff. It's not pretending to be like a really long melody or something, but it's richly detailed. It has interesting harmonic shifts, and it just seems classically. That's just like a classic Ukrainian black metal riff.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hear what you mean about how it gets more narrow and tense. The intervals close up as it goes on. Yeah. There's some overall. I mean, even the thing that happens after that kind of clean vocal section is kind of like the Akercocke, kind of like the Narbeleth thing. But that's where I was going to go next. Is that middle section really reminds me of Akercocke, which is a pretty mixed bag, to say the least, as a band. But they have some good songs.
Yeah, I think the idea of going back to Akercocke is kind of interesting. Like, it's not a band that I ever really liked, but I could see. Because Akercocke always had this sort of like odd sheen of black metal to it. Or like a pagan quality, and I could see sophisticated black metal guys like these dudes making something more out of some of those parts that they developed. They could probably go back to that. They could go back to like Wood of Ypres, some of those like odd black doom, Girlfriend and Trees bands from that era, and they could probably make something more productive out of it than the originals.
Here's another one that actually does have big swaggering black doom riffs like that. Is Velnius. Basically,
yeah.
If I've actually gone back to that, Sovereign Nocturnal is sick. I mean, that's a really good record.
Which is interesting because I always hear Velnias as like very post.
I think the newest stuff is. I think. Are you talking about like maybe you could hear that?
Their older stuff was too.
I think it's there, but it's played, but in the way that Neurosis is post. Like
Fair.
to me, Sovereign Nocturnal sounds like basically 50-50 Thousand Swords and Neurosis.
Yeah, because I used to talk to. I used to talk to the bassist of Velnias on Soulseek back in the day, and he seemed pretty interested in, in ISIS and some of the earlier post-metal stuff. But, this is like mid to late 2000s that I'm talking about, so maybe that's bleeding in.
I can totally hear the ISIS thing, yeah, or like, it's like the cool shit people call post-metal, like post-amoebics music. Yeah, just and they do there's cool guitar stuff on those records that you wouldn't hear on straight up black metal. And also, I mean, the songs are like 14 minutes long, so I think you do get sort of big climaxes in the way the post-rock bands do. But anyway, they're kind of a Velnias vibe in there, and if those sort of references are coming back around now, that's one that's worth checking out.
Yeah, that's cool. It seems like this band is pretty oriented around maybe some kind of forgotten 2000 stuff, or stuff that was popular but just like hasn't stayed in the zeitgeist. Let's go to the next song, which is one of my favorites on the record, Burning Eyes, Blackened Claws. So again, I'm gonna trot this one out again, but it's like it just keeps happening. We got another case of a highly melodic band moving back toward more dissonant and aggressive material to create moments of really high contrast. This one is, we're going to play the first couple minutes of it. This has some really spicy intervals. And one thing, well, actually, I'll give my commentary after it. Let's just give it a listen for now. So as you pointed out while we were listening to that, this sounds very French, but coming from a Ukrainian black metal band, it's sort of a very different spin on the whole Franco-Finnish idea there. Mm-hmm. The sequencing there is really neat. So you've got this this opening riff, which is a tense formation of a sort of Slavic folk melody, all based off these reverse chord shapes. And really, pretty much the first 3 riffs are all based off of these rough, sort of minor reverse chord shapes. But then the second and third riffs, which are like bolted to each other, it's like a 2-to-1 ratio on the B and C. Have some really hideous intervals in them. Very mutilation, like mid-era mutilation. I'm thinking like Black Millennium, Rattenkonig, albums like those, where it was just like Willie was just playing the worst shit imaginable on guitar all the time.
Yo, play the worst shit, Willie.
But here it's delivered in this very elegant, streamlined way, and they're playing with rhythm in a really interesting way. I like how that C riff, that sort of interrupter between the sections of the B riff, suddenly snap into this double time 6/8 feel. You know, the blast beat abruptly shifts into this really aggressive triplet time, which is interesting, especially with these sort of howling, wailing vocals over the top. I like this because, you know, doing highly dissonant shit is cool inherently, but a lot of the time it tends to be sort of gestural, just in that it's hard to make highly dissonant stuff sound like something. You know, to sound like something memorable and sort of appreciable for what it actually is in terms of content, rather than just being really gnarly. Here, They Came From Visions tends to use these super dissonant intervals and like bolt them to a more typical melodic phrase. You know, they're using the more typical melodic phrase as like a carrier wave for these like abrupt moments of intense dissonance. And that technique really reminds me of Lucifugum, who are a band that I've probably mentioned like a couple times on the show. But as far as underground Ukrainian black metal goes, they're one of the best. They have an enormous discography of probably, 20 fucking albums or something. And musically, they were just all over the place, starting with more sort of Nocturnal Mortem-related symphonic Slavblack, and then progressing into just weirder and weirder territory thematically changing on every one of the records. They've got like a weird sci-fi one, they've got like a serial killer one, and the music adjusts to conform to that. So if you want to like deep dive into a really weird band, check it out. Radio Free Innsmouth did a really good episode about them, sort of a remake episode of an older one that he did, and it's a really good primer on that band. So yeah, this reminds me a lot of like mid-era Lucifugum, where they were playing around with guitar ideas in a really exaggerated fashion that at a certain point only had a tenuous link to its sort of Slavic roots, but was still deeply enmeshed in them. You know, a certain kind of like demented Slavic weirdness.
Like Black Death.
Yeah, actually.
Lucifugum and Black Death kind of go together, right?
Yeah, I've never thought about that, but no, that totally makes sense. Yeah, Black Death very, very much would relate to Lucifugum. But yeah, so on this song, you get to hear some of the really intense dissonant stuff that pops up periodically on this record, and I actually think those moments are some of the most memorable. And I also like how that protracted section of intense dissonance makes that big sort of payoff French riff at the end of the sample land so much better. That's a riff that might be corny if the song opened with it.
But, yeah, you're right. Yeah.
But as this moment of tension release after that really extreme stuff that came before it, I think it's really good. And I like how this album, in terms of mood, plays with sort of like pagan triumph versus this, I don't know, ugly battlefield energy. You know, there's a lot of positivity and negativity dueling constantly throughout this record, and I think that's pretty neat.
Yeah, I hear what you mean. So thematically, this record is interesting. They say it's like folk horror black metal. Mm-hmm. I initially thought that was kind of a corny marketing trope. However, I thought about it because I was like, hey, black metal already is folk horror. But then, okay, black metal's already pagan. Black metal's already satanic. You can say that you play satanic black metal, right? Or like, whatever. And so, like folk horror is a possibility contained within black metal, right? It's been there since like Pagan Fears or Buried by Time and Dust, right? And usually when we find black metal that deals really directly in suffering, it's DSBM or something. But this seems to be about a less depressive and more kind of sort of ecstatic, not in the sense of like happy or nice, but in the sense of sort of extreme sort of mind-breaking intensity suffering, right? It's about like, not so much carrying out the human sacrifice as being the human sacrifice, or someone you know is the human sacrifice. It's the cover is a guy who seems to be lamenting a lamb he's slaughtered. And in the press release, they talk about it being, you're kind of at the mercy of these primordial forces rising from the soil, right? But I do think that at times the record, so the really gnarly riffs, like the ones you just played, definitely capture that, right? And even that first riff in Equinox Ablaze, right? They're talking about like the harvest failing and the village suffering and all that, right? With the lyrics, you have that riff that starts out epic and then kind of clamps up as it goes on. So you can hear it sonically, but it is true that there's a much more sort of affirmative and martial side to the record than maybe the sort of press material around it suggests, especially on the back half of the record.
The back half definitely sort of bears down into some really intense stuff. There's, I was listening to this again at the gym today, and there's actually like a lot of tracks that I'd love to sample if we had more time. Like The Blissful Defeat, I think, is a really excellent song. That's sort of the pivot point of the record, right in the middle. You capture, we end up catching the last two tracks. This is only a 7-track album, but every song really has something distinct to offer. Let's get to another one. Let's get to some more gnarly shit. The Sign of Damnation. So like I was saying before, I find myself really drawn to the really high tension stuff on this record. Here's a section of this song which is like high anxiety, which is not usually a feeling that you hear in Slavic black metal, at least not executed in this way. But again, it makes those huge payoff moments of more traditional like Slavblack melodies a lot more powerful. So at the end of that sample, you get one of the relatively few instances of just like full-fledged post-black riffing.
Yeah.
And it actually lands when it pops up on this record because, again, it's so earned.
sounds great.
Yeah, by everything around it. I think that, They Came From Visions have unlocked kind of a big trick with post-black, which is using that material and reinserting it into a more traditional black metal context and really making something of it. I think there's a couple different ways. I've been thinking about this a lot. I think there's a couple different ways to take post-black. You either take its material and just make black metal that uses some of those melodic ideas, like they're doing here, or you take it as a subgenre of, post-rock rather than as a subgenre of black metal, and you just incorporate some black metal ideas into the post-metal thing. I don't think you try to do a 50-50 split, but these guys seem to... these guys also have a post-black band. I believe that it's all the same guys. And I think they are really, in a large part, coming from that scene. But it seems like they've really worked out the kinks of how to execute that best within a more traditional black metal context. But regarding this sample, love that middle section. Love the vocal performance on this record. The theatrical sort of wailing thing. I'm immediately going to go to Grand Declaration of War for that whole section.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
But you're going to go to
The Cock Is Out. It sounds like Akercocke a lot. You have the kind of the sort of you have I think it's finger plucked bass there. Big prominent goth bass line and those skronky Killing Joke arpeggios, but played over blast beats, not as a goth part. And then the vocalist is doing this kind of sort of ritual declamation sort of thing. He's almost being overwhelmed by what he's saying. It's a very Akercocke move. I think I could try to dig out a sample now, but I feel like that's not strictly relevant to the rest of this record. But maybe I can play some Akercocke as the interlude.
Yeah, we could do that. It's and now that I'm thinking of it, a good friend of mine who's the drummer in a band that I'm in is a huge Akercocke fan and was one of the first people that really stood by Grand Declaration of War back in the day when we were growing up together. And I'm starting to think maybe those two things actually have a lot to do with each other.
You got to be right. Yeah, that would make a lot of sense because that Grand Declaration also has the declamatory vocals, and those two records are that just would have been one of the black metal things that Akercocke would have been into. Yeah, I mean, that has to be it.
Yeah.
And they're both kind of alternate paths to the DSO thing.
Both are bands trying to figure out what happens to black metal after the second wave.
Yeah. So, but yeah, just the fact that we had to whip out that reference point is a sign, or either of those. These guys have to be our age.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, if there's all these early 2000s pre-2010 touches on this. Yeah, you gotta be our age. But let's see. So, God, there's a lot of really good slow passages on this on this record, rather. The Blissful Defeat, is that a slower one?
It's pretty high contrast. It's got some slower sections, but it's also got some pretty up-tempo shit, too.
Just worth remarking that there's some very slow parts on this record that are awesome. And really kind of... you can kind of get lost in them in a wonderful way. But we're not going there. So we're going to go to Twilight Robes, which is the last track. And this is, on the last couple, the record starts really picking up the aggression and, becoming a lot more of a, almost a stompy black metal record. And we start out with a really sophisticated Hate Forest kind of riff. The riff is really a melody that is 4 phrases long. So listen for that to be completed. And then there's a B riff that's totally different. And then it has this interesting turnaround on it. So listen to that, but then we're going to get an abrupt change after that. But even the first riff has a really interesting structure.
I like the way that breakdown lands there.
I had to include a bit of that. That was so, I mean, that's really fucking funny, but it's awesome. You get that, so that's like a winter, that's a great example for what you've said about the winter filleth metalcore breakdown. Mm-hmm. They just do it, but they actually do the double bass flam.
Yeah.
And it's the only place on the record where you have like a really gay post-rock riff, but in context, it's extremely heavy.
Oh, I love that shit. Yeah. Oh, that's a total like 2000s melodic metalcore thing.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is your point. It was in melodic metalcore before it was in sort of post-rock or whatever.
Yeah.
But you know, it just kind of trails off there in a way that if that were presented as the main offering, could be lame. But in this context, it's actually a powerful release, and the drums keep it really heavy. Mm-hmm. And man, everything about that section is awesome. So the that storming riff at the beginning is very complicated.
There's a lot going on.
And it's based on.
I'm interested, like, how exactly that's being executed on guitar. Because I'm not sure if it's like a dual guitar thing that's happening. There's something odd technically about what's happening.
I see what you mean. There might be two guitars. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There is but yeah, that really nails the Senko style for the Hate Forest riff. Like just riff created out of like basically 2 or 3 trilling notes, and then the variation happens. The change happens as you repeat a section, and 1 or 2 of those notes are slightly different. And then there's that awesome turnaround, which with like the time change, sort of this like galloping major key kind of riff, and then back to the storming part, really cool. And then boom, we get basically a folk black riff on the Ode to Joy, played with power chords. Right? That's the only thing I can think of, right? It's one of those things that's like so epic and majestic that nobody even thinks to rip it off. But it's right there, and these guys did it. And they, instead of just ripping it off, they made it a plausible sort of like hardcore riff, almost. and it sounds just totally manic. They're playing it much faster than a lot of bands would, which gives
it's almost coming apart, especially set against the weird rhythm of that Ode to Joy riff set against that static thrash beat is really interesting.
Yeah. It's definitely sounds sort of crazed. And the I love that the vocalist does not one but two uhs.
He couldn't decide which one.
The first time I heard it, I was like, he's gonna do it right. Oh yeah, he did it. So that's a great part. And then you come out of that riff, and you don't leave it alone, right? Instead of just being like, that was the cool climactic part, they're like, okay, we're going to do something else, right? And then you get just this intricate spiraling kind of like Ludomisel riff that's really synced up with the vocals, right? Night will destroy us, night will redeem us, blah, blah, blah.
I think that this song is pretty much just like perpetually escalating stakes for 6 minutes, you know?
That's a good way of putting it. And then, I mean, yeah, dude, that last part's pretty cool.
The ending?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. That is awesome. The trick that they pull. That, you know, a setup for a huge post-black part, but it just ends up being like the world's biggest heavy metal riff. I guess my big thing with this record that's really striking me is that taking, like, just describing it structurally, it would sound horribly disjointed. And I think that even if you played a riff for me and then played the subsequent riff with, like, 5 seconds of silence in between, I would think it was terrible. But these guys managed to stick the landing on these super high contrast pivots multiple times per song in a way that I find really exceptional. I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism is, but these guys are able to pull off these really daring structural maneuvers, and I think that they're really worth looking out for just for that reason alone.
I think it's I think the reason they pull it off is because at like the base of it, they're really just committed to basic extreme metal riffcraft.
Mm-hmm. right, we are back with a kind of a surprise return record from a band that I enjoy a lot, but I don't think I've ever mentioned on the show. This is the newest record by Convulsing, titled Perdurance. Or is it Perdurance? I don't know the word.
I think Perdurance. That sounds right.
Okay. Out now independently, as most of his work is, but I'm sure it'll get probably picked up for some sort of limited physical releases. I think he might have a vinyl version coming independently, but I'm not sure. So, for those unfamiliar, Convulsing is a dissonant death metal band that started with the first record, Errata, in 2016, and I stumbled across the first record basically when it came out, and I really enjoyed it right up front. Convulsing is definitely a band that is very purely within its own style, that dissonant death metal style, and it will at first blush sound remarkably similar to a lot of the other dissodeath stuff that you've heard, but something has always struck me about this band as having a little bit more substance and depth and weight to it than a lot of the other stuff. Dissodeath can be thought of as sort of the child of caverncore and of orthodox black metal, two styles that I've never been that interested in myself.
DSO plus ulcerate plus a bunch of incantation style bands I can't remember the names of.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
For people that still want to argue that, like, Abyssal is really fucking awesome, bro. I don't know. Maybe they were fine. I can't remember. I can't remember what any of these bands sound like. But I can remember what Convulsing sounds like because it's pretty cool. I think that there's an argument to be made that Convulsing... simply calling them dissodeath might be doing a little bit of a disservice, because it seems to me that Brendan Sloan, the main member behind this band, he has a live lineup, but he's the sole musician on the recordings, has sort of a deeper appreciation of death metal as a genre than a lot of the dissodeath bands do, and I think also just as a songwriter, he's interested in things that hew a little bit more closely to conventional death metal song structure than a lot of people might anticipate. Convulsing is, yes, very dissonant and sort of hyper-modern by default, but if you listen to these songs, they're like surprisingly straightforward in the way they're delivered. It's a lot of 4 of this riff, 4 of that riff. It primarily operates in 4/4 time, apart from some like very obvious alterations in time signature. There's no real tricks played on the audience. This is just death metal that is very down the line and very deliberately weird. And I think that it owes a lot to progressive death metal stuff from the 90s and 2000s in that conceit. A lot of dissodeath seems to be in a sort of arms race with itself to create just the weirdest and most indecipherable music possible. And that reached its conclusion a couple years ago with the Ad Nauseam record, Imperative Imperceptible Impulse. That's the weirdest one. I don't think we're really going to get weirder than that.
Yeah.
But the new Convulsing record suggests that even within this style, even if it's been completed, so to speak, at least insofar as how extreme and bizarre it can get, maybe there is blood to get out of the stone just in terms of making very good albums in this style. I'll get into it a little bit more as we play samples, but I'm probably going to have a little bit of a difficult time myself trying to describe why I like this so much more than many bands who, in all fairness, sound a lot like it. But before that, Black Metal Guy, I think you were familiar with this band, but I assume you'd never listened to it.
Not really. They're like, I had seen that, they had some cool album covers. I've seen the album covers, but I was never particularly interested. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So now that you've heard one, what do you think?
First time I listened, I really didn't like it. I found it pretty dull. Sort of just skronk, as they say. But I wasn't listening that carefully. And I made myself listen again a few times last night, and I liked it more. I still don't know that I love it. There's this kind of there's this kind of nihilistic angst to this sort of stuff that I'm not very interested in. However, it really, when you listen more closely, it really is about more than ugliness or sort of things falling down. It's as you say, it sounds more like death metal the more you listen to it. In part because there's this sort of chassis of death metal drumming and bass, often like very conventional in a good way, like classic death metal beats. And there's a lot of aggression in the playing, and yeah, riffs that are not just, it's not just one of four of this, four of that. It's that the riffs are pretty clearly marked off from one another. Maybe that's a way that this connects to They Came From Visions, right? This is kind of a random episode, but like they both have some pretty bizarre harmonies, and more than that, the closer you look, they both work more like recognizably 90s extreme metal. So I appreciate the aspect of it that is more death metal, and also I think I enjoyed the prog parts here. I think sort of because the most sort of choppy, dissonant sort of stuff can sort of become very homogenous to me. A lot of the parts that stood out were actually where he let things breathe a little and brought out more like winding leads, sometimes noodly, but kind of in a good way. Which supply a more direct kind of melody, even though they're often very odd melodies, and build some atmosphere in music that's otherwise almost anti-atmospheric. So I found that interesting, and as I listened, I thought, okay, it's more like death metal than I thought, and what it really sounds like is prog rock. And I think we arrived at a pretty similar thing, which is maybe this world of dissodeath, or even the black metal too, just this world of disso stuff. It just is what prog rock sounds like in the age of extreme metal. Or it is what prog metal sounds like. And, you know, maybe this band is all the better for the fact that he's like aware of that and makes the most of it.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things at work here that differentiate this band. Sort of jumping off what you said regarding the death metal chassis. I guess it didn't occur to me, but maybe one of the simple and obvious things that makes Convulsing distinct is that there's a real premium placed on aggression. This is very heavy and angry music. The vocal performance is very intense and not, swathed in a bunch of reverb. This is still aggressive attacking music in a way that a lot of the dissodeath stuff really isn't. It's just sort of like swelling and atmospheric.
It's more like the thing I said. It's sort of a nihilistic. It's music that sort of tears itself apart, but in a kind of in a way that's sort of, it does it quietly in its bedroom.
Yeah.
Right? You're right. And when I first listened to this, it was on lower volume. It was more distant. So all I heard were those sorts of textures. But the more you listen, the aggression really does come out. It's very important here.
Yeah. Definitely worth listening to at high volume. You get a lot more of an experience out of it that way. And the other thing is just that idea of prog. And you get the sense that Brendan might be sort of like an Opeth bro at heart. You know what I mean? An Opeth bro who nonetheless really appreciates like genuinely extreme music. And I think we're starting to hear a little bit more of that coming out, especially because, our age bracket is, dead center for Opeth bro. It's like between the ages of 31 and 36 is where Opeth bros are located. But I think that a lot of the prog touches you hear on this, a lot of the sort of like shimmering, clean guitar, a lot of these instrumental breaks that dot this album really are coming more from stuff like Opeth than they are DSO. And I think that that's a big differentiating factor, that even if the end result sounds kind of similar to other dissodeath, the ultimate feeling of it ends up being very different. So with that said, let me get to a sample. Let's go to Inner Oceans. So this is just going to kind of demonstrate one of the primary modes this band operates in, where there's a lot of like really blistering, aggressive, blast-oriented stuff, and we'll hear some of that in other samples. But a lot of this operates in a more open rhythmic territory, including a lot of playing around with kind of spooky orthodox arpeggio figures, but more in the sense of Blood Aus Nord, where it's about sort of inscrutable obscurity and gray fog rather than, spooky Halloween sounds. And then from there, we're going to move into a passage where he's orienting things around this sort of Meshuggah meets modern down-tempo idea of these ugly, skronky, chugged open palm mutes, which is another mode that he operates in a lot, but he adds a sort of distinct flavor to these moments that are kind of unique to this band. I really like the streamlined, stripped down Meshuggah type stuff that he does across this record. It's not meant to be anywhere near as complex and polyrhythmic, but the overall effect is the same with that displaced snare across these staccato guitar lines. I think they're really neat, and I think that in this case it is coming like very directly from Meshuggah, which is, that's another case of like, okay, Opeth Bro is also really into Meshuggah, and we are ardent Meshuggah defenders on this show, as them just being an awesome band. So I think that, if I'm just psychoanalyzing myself, Convulsing is cool because it's dissodeath oriented around all the cool stuff of guys in my exact age bracket. All of our favorite shit from high school, basically.
All the shit that the long-haired kid in high school was really into.
Exactly.
Like literally, he had those shirts.
Yeah, right? Yeah. He had his Meshuggah Nothing shirt that he wore to social studies class all the time.
And then he had his Opeth shirt. That he
Actually,
wore.
Well, the coolest guy in my high school, when I was a sophomore, there was a guy around who was a senior who I just saw a few times, and he had an Isis Panopticon shirt, and that was really fucking cool. That was like the coolest shirt at my school. So
yeah, I think there were some good. I think the coolest guy in my school had a Converge shirt, which was sick.
The other coolest guy could play Vital Remains "Dechristianize" on guitar.
Well,
he smoked a lot of pot. So anyway,
dechristianize your mind, bro.
Anyway, yeah. So this is sort of like the open kind of proggy Bloodos Nord territory. I always like to specify Bloodos Nord, because they were so instrumental in creating the Orthodox sound, but Orthodox ultimately ended up sounding actually nothing like Bloodos Nord, even if at first blush they seem similar. Because I really love those. I was going to say mid-era, but I guess they're probably early Bloodos Nord records at this point. The work which transforms God and the next few records after that. And I think that this record probably has a lot to do with those.
There's a cool thing that happens here when I was listening for the Meshuggah part. I started picking up on it long before the actual gent section. Because he starts to do those kind of staggered chugs with the offset snare while the first guitar is much more still in sort of atmospheric land. Like there's a long section where he's like setting up the stutter rhythm, and then he just commits to it in a way where it suddenly comes to the foreground in a way that's been prepared for.
And he has that brief introduction of it between the two long sort of languid clean guitar sections.
Oh yeah. So, and then I like the thing he does at the end, which is you do the chug, and then the way you get out of it is you just go, Hurr!
Yeah, you just do a war metal part.
Yeah, you basically just totally is massive blasting and just a low guttural and war metal or bolt thrower, which brings us to my next sample.
Okay. Oh yeah, your next sample of the coolest track on the album easily.
Yeah, Gossamer Paul is awesome.
Yeah, you got to your notes before I did, and I saw it. I was like, oh, you son of a bitch. But I'm glad you picked up on it too.
This is a very cool track. It opens in a kind of interesting way. It sort of like head fakes that the song is going to be more complicated than it is. And what it is at first is like this kind of staggered sequence of kind of like black-gazy guitar riffs, or like a dissodeath take on florid romantic black metal riffs. But there's a whole series of them with shifting root notes and kind of stutters between them. And then it really locks in, but not even on the note you would expect it to. So we're going to start at the very end of that kind of extended intro section. And let's see what in Sweden, it's cold, and I need my meds.
Man, I gotta say, just like you said, it's structurally simpler than you anticipate, but man, just that whole guitar line for those first couple minutes is like really intricate. Like it's tough to follow that riff, and it's in those moments where it's more melodic, this guy's guitar style is really fascinating to me. The way it's hard to hear it congeal into individual riffs. It feels more like he's floating around a series of notes, and there's always a frustrated quality to it that I really enjoy. Like he's trying to figure out what the right phrase is, and he keeps sort of like scribbling it off and trying something new. I don't know. I really enjoy that, which I guess kind of works with the theme of the record. You know, this sort of like, you know, internalized suffering and self-loathing, and, you know.
Yeah, but the cool thing is that even though it sounds like he's trying to figure out what the riff is, the riff is there.
Yeah, it is.
That's like, and it doesn't sound, it sounds in a way more unique than it would if he nailed it. So I think you're talking about, so the parts that really interested me were the beginning and the end, but you're talking about the middle of that section, around like the 24-minute mark.
Yeah, I'm talking about
another 45 seconds.
Yeah, that whole extended middle section where he keeps sort of cutting it off and interrupting it with that big dun 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 phrase.
Yes, yeah.
Which is just, that's sort of like him like erasing what came before and then getting back to scribbling out that riff, you know?
And that's like a bombastic arena death metal gesture. That's like a fucking Nile or Behemoth thing.
Yeah, I was thinking Nile, yeah.
But the riffs he's playing there are like his sort of dissodeath version of something really kind of, lush, melancholy Euro black metal, like da 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 da. Like it sounds kind of like, I mean, they're American, but they're doing Eastern European stuff. Kathan or Odal from Germany or something. Okay. Just very kind of, sort of, like romantic classical melodies with that yearning to them. But they're all getting cut off. They're being sort of geometrically rearranged in a really cool way. And as you say, sort of like arbitrarily truncated and dislocated. But somehow the overall melodic idea emerges over it. Like it never, I don't feel unsatisfied by it. If anything, I feel like if he had just locked down that melody, it would just be like, oh, it's a black metal riff. Right?
Yeah,
he's doing like a whist.
You're sort of understanding the riff through the negative space. Like you're getting the real riff is what's happening in your head, the idea of it. You know?
Yes, which is a very refined thing to do, but this is pretty heady stuff. I think it works here. Because what's happening in your ear is still very like high intensity, right? You get like something, this ethereal, unheard riff is the riff, but it's also just like battering your eardrums. So there's that cool middle part, but the first part is like bolt thrower, right? Just like, you can hear the rhythm. The rhythms are so much more traditional than in a lot of this modern sort of prog skronk stuff. So you get, downbeat thrash beat, really fast downbeat thrash, double bass, blast, downbeat, and each one of those he's holding a chord over it. And he's starting out with the bass is playing the root, but you would expect on like a riff like this the chord to start at the root or something, and it doesn't. It's one of those weird suspended sort of post-rock harmonies or something. And so he does like one chord. The riff is 4 chords, each one held over the drum beat, but it really feels like the early bolt thrower records and the way those are delivered. Then it lights into that part the death metal guy was just talking about, with the more fragmented blasting. And then at about 25-30, I noted it, you just get this, everything peels away, and we get this da 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 da, or da 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 da. We get this sort of like catatonia duplets, right? Da 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 da. And it just really sounds like Catatonia, and that whole network of gothic death doom bands. And at first it's delivered in this kind of, in the most noodling prog way possible. So I guess tying it into stuff like Opeth. But eventually, towards the end, he makes it sort of explicit, where he really lays on sort of the, I guess, distortion or whatever, and the sound comes to the foreground and sort of solidifies, and you get an actual death doom kind of lead. And one thing that's cool is that underneath that, the whole time, you've still got these breakdown triplet rolls on the drums, working sort of against them. So it doesn't just sit in death doom territory. The basic rhythmic structure of the rest of the song is still there, moving it forward.
Yeah. Overall, despite how weird this album might get melodically, its execution is very straightforwardly heavy metal a lot of the time.
Yeah. But smartly, right? Mm-hmm. Because he's not locked into genre. So he doesn't think, oh great, now I have to do death doom drums, whatever those are, right, under this part. Mm-hmm. He just keeps playing Meshuggah Mosh double bass.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really neat. And that's one of those moments where it gets a little more proggy, but somehow acquires more melodic focus from that. Mm-hmm. Which is important given that the rest of it is either these kinds of deliberately decentered chords, or the kind of passages you were highlighting where there's melodies that are really sort of fragmented. It sort of solidify in the moments that feel most sort of gossamer noodly prog. It actually has the melody coalesces and becomes more direct in a way I enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that part's cool. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about that part? Because you also really liked all that shit.
I mean, it's just an awesome song. I think that it's easily the best. I think that it really combines the most abstract stuff and the most direct and rippingly aggressive stuff perfectly. And I think that it's a great example of why I elevate this band above most of the dissodeath.
Yeah, fair enough. It's almost like he was gonna do oh, here's my more melodic black metal influence song, but then he couldn't help just writing
pulverizing.
The shit. Yeah. Yes, writing something pulverizing and with all with complete focus, so that instead of being a genre exercise, it just became his style, right?
Yeah.
Very cool. So now, speaking of pulverizing, this is Shattered Temples. This is the next track. It's a very strong sequence. So
yeah, this back half of the record is very, very strong.
Right. So the end of Gossamer Paul is a little more sort of spacey and depressive. But then we get to the sort of angry depressive of Shattered Temples. And one thing that makes this death metal or death metal-esque is how vicious the vocals are. It's a sort of a deep. How would you describe the vocal tone? It's like a growl, higher growl, but pretty deep as things go.
Yeah, he plays around with the exact pitch a lot, but he tends to hang out in a register that's more like Melodeath Fry vocals, but delivered in a more traditional death metal growl.
Yeah, very, very harsh. And as we always talk about, you can tell who has watched the How to Do Vocals DVD and who is doing vocal, who is screaming. Yeah, you can tell who is doing vocals and who is screaming. This guy is screaming, so there's fully intended delivery, and he also carefully enunciates the lyrics, and they've been written. Once you listen to this once or twice, you start to realize that the lyrics have been written around the music in an interesting way. They are. I think he probably wrote the music first, but there's been very careful effort to time out the vocals with the music, in a way that you're giving the vocals. There's a care put into the rhythm of the vocal patterns that he would put into the timing of the drums or bass, right? And so here's a passage where you get some of the more sort of disjointed, kind of skronky stuff that if you just listened to it kind of passively while doing something else, you might just be like, oh, this is a morass of dissonant guitar or a fractured rhythm. It's not really true. This is an extraordinarily brutal and aggressive part, and it comes through in part because of the vocals. It gets this sort of operatic feel to it. So I'll read off the lyrics for this sample, and then that'll help you track them as it goes. Shattered Temples. Let's see. Passenger to poisoned world, ruled by the whim of small men, piteous and shallow. False heirs, bold with facile prowess. Lamb in wolfskin, miserable and afraid, stands upon a veil of blood and bone, erecting monuments to vanity, boot on the throat of humanity. With those two lines, it really takes off. Manipulator, captor, oppressor, hated circle of tyrants, feasting on suffering, drunk on grief, fattened along on death's bounty. Dethrone, banish, erase them all. Render temples raised, shatter icons and sweep them away. And so it really cranks up with that last stanza. So listen for all of that, and it's pretty heavy.
Impressed by his ability to put a Celtic Frost reference and an Anata reference in the lyrics of the same song. Props to him for that.
Nice. What's the Anata one?
Under a Stone with No Inscription.
Nice.
That's the, I think it's our first album, first or second.
Yeah, so we were just talking about that last riff, which is crazy.
Yeah, that thing is fucking gross.
He's like doing some sort of rhythmic trick where like it sounds like the stabs, right? There's the main sort of chug, and then there's these stabs of the second guitar coming in over it. It sounds like those are like off time or something, but they're just on the one. But something's happening that makes them feel extremely syncopated. And
he's just sort of like, I think that it can all be done on one guitar. It's just sort of like a weird descending octave thing, and he's just sort of swing timing the back handful of notes. So it's dan dun dun dan dun dun dan.
So he's just basically playing a thrash riff, but really fast.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah. But as he does it, right, the time between those hits gets shorter and shorter. There's some sort of trick you can do. It's been a long time, but like where you sort of count. You do a 4 count and then a 2 count and then a 1 count in between you can sort of like create off time stuff in this kind of almost procedural way where you're gradually shortening the intervals. And he's doing something like that here, where the after 2 repetitions, the hit comes faster and faster each time. It's like the rhythmic version of the melodic choking up that They Came From Visions did on that one riff we were talking about. But it's very cool there. And a thing, so you could listen to all of this, or at least like past me could listen to it and be like, okay, this is all just like sort of choppy kind of, that you could say it's sort of discontinuous in a way that undermines the heaviness, but it's not. It's really heavy. Yeah. And part of the feeling...
It's actually, and it's very continuous too, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think the, that riff itself is very, more and more you hear, there's very discrete beginnings and ends to the riffs, but that's more just in the way that like a Morbid Angel riff has a very discrete beginning and an end, right? It doesn't like flow over to the next one. It sort of stops and then restarts. But part of, I think, what makes this really work for me is the vocals, which are drawn out in a way that none of the notes are. And when you have the guitars that are changing so rapidly and doing these kinds of like choppy, weird rhythms, the vocals are supplying continuity. And when there's one of these pauses as the riff ends and restarts or has a kind of stutter in it, the vocals are powering through that and filling in that space. And so it prevents it from feeling, at no point does it feel thin or skittering in the way that some music in these styles can.
Yeah, the vocals can kind of form the glue that keeps all these disparate rhythms together.
Yeah, and you could hear how much he means those vocals, those lyrics, right? I mean, it's just a very aggressive, angry vocal performance.
Yeah. Okay, one more. So there's a big epic at the end of the album called Endurance. It's the 12-minute track before the porcupine tree cover that ends the album, which is like, at first blush, absurd, but then you listen to it and it's like, oh no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, of course this guy would be into porcupine tree. That kind of scans. So here we're going to take a look at some of the post-metal ideas that creep into this record in fits and starts. And this guy has a real talent for using those melodies, sort of like They Came From Visions. You see, there were more parallels than we thought originally on this record. Like They Came From Visions, this guy has a really good sense of how to use post-metal melodic content in a more traditional extreme metal framework. Here we're going to get another instance of a riff sort of like on Gossamer Paul, that sort of frustrated working itself out trem riff, before we collapse into a reverb guitar passage that's very Opeth. And then the ideas start to fuse together in a really interesting way. And actually, one thing that's interesting, it's not in the sample, but immediately after the sample, the guy goes into a completely respectable funeral doom passage, like a Shape of Despair kind of thing, and it actually lands really well.
I was thinking of Shape of Despair when I was talking about that sort of Catatonia riff. It might even be more a Shape of Despair riff than a Catatonia riff.
Yeah, this guy seems to have a real sense. He's got it's weird to hear more traditional styles of like doom approached in an environment, like a musical environment like this, but I really like it, and I think he nails it pretty well. But I really like the riff. I think I've decided what really sets Convulsing apart from other bands is that, in this style, at least, in this dissodeath style, is that there's just more happening. You know, there's more consideration of the riffs. There's more real melodies, either harsh or traditionally melodic. It's not just an endless array of textures. There's more genuine mood, not just quote-unquote atmosphere provided by a lot of reverb and delay. It's more of a band, and the music is more considered and serious. It's not merely an exercise. There's feeling behind it, and there's a commitment to the idea that I think is just well beyond a lot of dudes making stuff that sounds superficially similar.